Well, clearly the term hypocrisy is leveled at the United States. We, we look at the so-called war on terror as beginning in Afghanistan in October of 2001. That was the first U.S. action, really, in September. There were some strikes. That's according to the official narrative here. But the war in Afghanistan began in 1979 in earnest under the Carter administration with Zbigniew Brzezinski bringing arms and organizing troops to resist the government in Kabul. These were organized among the peasants who were more or less the slaves of the old landed aristocracy, whose lands were being taken by the government and redistributed to the peasants so that they could farm it and, enter at least the 19th century, if not the 20th century at that time. They were organized into a battle with the Kabul government in order to create what Brzezinski called Russia's or the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In other words, a bloody conflict that would last for many years. They got their wish because they lit a match essentially in July of 1979, and that fire is still burning. So the U.S. is in the Middle East and these other countries supposedly fighting terrorism, but it is the father of that terrorism and of the terrorist groups, such as the Mujahideen, that it organized. Absolutely. This is a gift that keeps on giving, in essence. What the U.S. did in Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s has been both copied from what the U.S. has done in other parts of the world, over its entire history, more or less. That is, putting the people on the ground at each other's throats and walking off with the gold. But in particular, in the Middle East, this was cloned. You had suddenly this great divide between Sunni and Shia, for example, that didn't exist for the hundreds of years since these two groups became separate groups, as inside the religion. Now these are banners to organize around for mass murder. And again, the U.S. and the European colonial powers, who, by the way, created much of the precondition for what's happening now in that region and elsewhere, they walk off with the gold yet again. In Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in a half dozen countries in Africa, in Saudi Arabia itself, in Yemen, in all over the region, really. There's been war going on against, at least since 1979. Really, many would say since the theft of Palestine by Europeans and Americans, gifting it to the white settlers that now call themselves Israelis. The region has been at war for a good 70, 80 years, and the arms come from the United States, the training comes from the United States, the ideological raison comes from the United States, and since at least the 60s and 70s, they've been quote-unquote fighting terrorism, which, again, is a terrorism they created, whether it's the Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, al-Nusra. These are all groups that are the children of Langley and the Pentagon. Well, first of all, there's the domestic component. The United States used Afghanistan, which bordered the Soviet Union, as a staging area for the creation of what ultimately became Al-Qaeda, and that is the Mujahideen. They spread into areas of the Soviet Union where there were, Muslim populations, with some groups among them, following the line that came from Saudi Arabia, the propaganda line, the sect that was used to spread hate against other groups, including other Muslims. They had to deal with terrorism on their own territory from Dagestan and other places inside Russia itself, and they've done so successfully. In addition to that, they have become engaged, particularly, most notably, in Syria. Their involvement at the UN Security Council was acquiescence to resolutions 1970 and 1973, along with China, by the way, with respect to Libya, that was perverted and used as an excuse by the U.S. to bomb Libya into the Stone Age. The Russians and Chinese had no understanding that that's what was going to happen, because the language of those resolutions doesn't allow it, but that's what was done. And then the U.S. tried to roll into Syria, and Russia and China stopped the air war against Syria at the UN Security Council back in 2011 and several times after that. Then there was the so-called chemical attack that was used as an excuse by the Obama administration to attempt to do an aerial campaign against Syria, and Russia again diffused that by negotiating a termination of any chemical weapons on the soil of Syria with the Syrian government. And then after that opportunity for the U.S. to go in and intervene as they did in Libya was quieted, the U.S. just stepped up their efforts, and so Russia finally in September of 2015, at the request of the Syrian government, got involved in taking aerial attacks and providing aerial support to the Syrian government against the terrorist groups that were operating in Syria. Their role has been, in essence, to liberate the bulk of Syria's territory from the terrorists that the U.S., Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel have backed in Syria, and return the land to the control of the Syrian government and the Syrian people. So that's pretty much been their role. In Syria most visibly, but around the region you're starting to see this. I think there's also an understanding among the neocons, for example, that if they were to try and start war with Iran, where Russia would stand on that, and also, by the way, China. So Russia is playing a very important role at this point in the fight against terrorism, and that role in very short term is fighting terrorists, actually fighting them and not using them as weapons. Inside the United States, there are multiple centers of power at the moment that are fighting over particularly this issue. For what it's worth, the incumbent president, when he ran for president, his campaign had a divergence from the policy of the previous presidents going back to at least Carter on the question of regime change. You could say going back to George Washington. And that was that the type of regime change that we saw in Iraq and in Libya, he mentioned specifically, and the type of policy being pursued in Syria, he said was not the policy that should be followed, and that he would no longer, he would reverse that policy. Now, whether he intends or intended to do that or not is a separate question, although there's some important indications of it. There are some shiny objects in the corner. Well, they bombed these 8 Syrian troops and they did this or that. But the material condition has changed on the ground dramatically in favor of the Syrian government and Russia. And I believe that's in part due to a change of activity and direction by the U.S. on the ground in Syria, with contradictions. On the other hand, there are people who developed this policy back with Brzezinski, and Kissinger in the 70s and even earlier, and that have been its champion and its executioners, more or less, in the period since, the last 40, 50 years since. They were represented by Hillary Clinton in the last election, and they are represented across the Congress. Last month we saw, a vote with 517 out of the 535 members of the 2 houses of Congress voting for more sanctions against Iran, among other things. That bloc is very present in the U.S. government still, and its opposition to President Trump, despite the many reasons that one might want to oppose President Trump, including the rhetoric that he tosses at Iran, is actually founded in the policy changes that he's either begun to implement or threatens to implement, according to his campaign rhetoric. So Washington speaks with 2 voices. As frightening as it may sound, Trump may actually be the moderate voice on these things, not in terms of what he says, but in terms of the policy that he threatens to bring, that is the source of much of the opposition of the existing establishment, the neocons and the neoliberals.